In this lesson, we will learn about our human digestive system. Now, it is important for you to take note that there are other names which we call our human digestive system, namely gut as well as alimentary canal. You will see this word alimentary canal used a lot during national exam, so you need to be familiar with it. So the objective of this lesson is you will learn the functions of different parts of our digestive system. So you may pause this video and copy down the objective. Now that you have copied down the objective, let's proceed to learn about the different parts of our alimentary canal or our digestive system. It is important to take note that the food that we consume will go through several organs, but they themselves are assisted by a few others, which we will go through in the next slide. Organs which the food passes through are, firstly, the food will enter through the mouth. Then, it will pass through the esophagus. You will have learned the name of esophagus as gullet in primary school, but in secondary school, we will use its scientific name, which is esophagus. After moving through the esophagus, which connect the mouth to the stomach, the food will end up in stomach. So the food will stay in stomach for a few hours before it is finally released into the small intestine. So this long mass of an organ is the small intestine. After all the digestion is done in the small intestine, the food goes into the large intestine. Then after the large intestine, it will be digested through the anus. So these are all the organs which our food passes through. But they themselves alone is not sufficient to digest our food efficiently. To do that, we need to call upon the help of other organs. First of all, we have our liver. The liver is connected to the gallbladder, and the gallbladder is connected to the bile duct. So the bile duct will release the secretion or some fluid that the liver produces into the small intestine. Then over here, we have another organ called the pancreas. So pancreas will also release some enzyme into the small intestine. So these are all the organs that you will need to know. So I hope that you have paused the video earlier on and copy down the name of the organ together with making a simple sketch of the alimentary canal. If not, you can always rewind, pause, and copy the organs down. Liver and pancreas is also important, so you will also need to take note of their function as well as their location. But just a slight note, liver is actually a lot bigger than that. It is actually behind the stomach and is a lot bigger than that. So let us start our digestion journey in our mouth. So in the mouth, of course, we have our teeth, and the function is to chew our food into smaller pieces. This is a form of physical digestion. Our tongue will roll the food into a ball for us to swallow it. Inside our mouth, there is also salivary gland, which, surprise, surprise, produce saliva. So inside our saliva, it contains this enzyme known as salivary amylase. This amylase will digest the starch into maltose. Saliva also wet our food so that it can easily be swallowed. So what you have to take note here is, inside our mouth, there is physical digestion, which is the chopping down of food, as well as chemical digestion of starch. How about other nutrients? No, there is no chemical digestion of protein and no chemical digestion of fats inside our mouth. The amylase produced by our saliva only digests starch into maltose. So this one is important. Copy this down. Lastly, you might see a new word that you might not have heard before, which is gland. So these glands, right, they are specialized tissue or organ that release chemical substances. In this case, the chemical substances released by the salivary gland is salivary amylase. So copy all of this down and we will move on to the esophagus. The muscle contract and relax to push the food down towards the stomach. No digestion will occur in the esophagus beside the salivary amylase that is present in the food, and they will continue to digest the starch. After the esophagus, the food will be deposited into our stomach. Oh, I can hear some of you yewing already. But this is what occurs in your stomach, so this is part of you. So inside our stomach, the muscle will contract, churning up the food and hence physically breaking them down into smaller pieces. Churning of food is like stirring. So you can imagine like a witch stirring her potion. This is what our stomach is doing, or the muscle inside our stomach is doing. It will churn up the food. So now I think a lot of you are being grossed out. You might want to pause the video, but hey, I can actually make the GIF disappear. Ta-da! Okay. Beside the physical digestion of food, which breaks them down into even smaller pieces, there are also glands that are inside the stomach which release gastric juice. So gastric juice is not difficult for you to memorize because like you have gastric pain. Where do you have gastric pain? It's somewhere around your stomach. So inside the gastric juice, it contains the enzyme protease to digest protein, which speed up the activities of the enzyme as well as killing of bacteria. So the gastric juice have two functions. One is to provide the enzyme to digest protein as well as to kill the bacteria because it contains hydrochloric acid. So please copy this down. You may pause the video. What is important for you to take note is a lot of people might think that, oh, digestion only takes place in the stomach, but not true because firstly, because earlier on, we have learned that digestion also takes place in the mouth. Then, inside the stomach, do you see any other nutrients being digested? In fact, there's only one nutrient that is digested in the stomach, and that is the protein. Fats as well as carbohydrate, they are not digested inside the stomach. So, if you think about it, stomach isn't the organ that digests most of our food. Most of our food, they are digested in the small intestine. So inside the small intestine, the muscle will also contract and relax like esophagus to mix the intestinal juice, which is the fluid that is released by the small intestine. Those intestinal juice contains the enzyme maltase, protease, as well as lipase. So this intestinal juice will be mixed with pancreatic juice as well as the bowel. What are they? We'll learn about them in the next slide. Don't worry about it. So the function of small intestine is actually to digest starch, protein, as well as fats. So you can see that all the nutrients are digested in the small intestine rather than our stomach. So inside the small intestine, after the food is being digested into soluble molecules, they will be absorbed into the bloodstream. So small intestine is responsible for reabsorption of 90% of the water. That means most of the water is actually absorbed in the small intestine. Now, people might confuse as to which organ, small intestine or large intestine, absorb the most water. It is actually the small intestine. Large intestine is responsible for absorbing the remaining water. But that's just about the function of large intestine, which is why people might think that, oh, large intestine absorbs most of the water. But this is not true. That is like one of its few functions. Whereas small intestine, it also digests food and is also responsible for absorbing those soluble food molecules. So please copy all of this down. The picture not important. Like for example, small intestine, you can see that it actually have 3 parts: duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Not important for you to know the different parts. You just have to know that it's called a small intestine. So the organ that helps in digestion is the pancreas, which release amylase, protease, as well as lipase. And those enzymes will be released into our small intestine, helping with the digestion of food. Our liver produces and releases bile, which emulsify fats. So here you will see a new word, emulsify. What's the meaning of emulsify? Emulsification is the physical breakup of fats into tiny droplets. This will help to increase surface area and speed up digestion. So this is a form of physical digestion. Bile produced by liver actually physically digests the fats that is in the small intestine. So what they will do is breaking the fat droplets or big fat droplets into tiny droplets. So the bile will be released into the gallbladder. The gallbladder will store the bile, and when food enters the small intestine from the stomach, the gallbladder will be triggered and release bile into the small intestine. So pancreas and liver will help in the digestion of food. Pancreas supply the chemical weapon, which is the enzyme, while liver supply the physical strength, which is the bile. So small intestine is where all the digestion will end. So all the nutrients will be digested in the small intestine, and the digested nutrients, which are soluble, will be absorbed by the small intestine into the bloodstream and get carried to our cell. But of course, there are also undigested food which we do not have the suitable enzyme to digest them, and they will go into the large intestine. Large intestine, or the colon, is the site whereby the remaining water, mineral salt, as well as vitamins are absorbed. Undigested food, such as the cellulose of the plant or your dietary fiber, are passed into the large intestine. So the undigested food will move along the large intestine and get stored in the rectum. Rectum is the area just above the anus. So feces will be stored there, and when you are ready, the anus will expel the feces. And this process is known as egestion. So there's no digestion that takes place in the large intestine. All the digestion will end in the small intestine. What remains in the large intestine are undigested food, which is the cellulose of your plant or dietary fiber. So please copy down all of this before we move to the last slide. So in summary, inside our mouth, there is physical digestion in the form of chewing, as well as chemical digestion, whereby salivary amylase convert starch into maltose. Inside our stomach, the churning of food will physically digest them into smaller pieces, and the protease present inside our stomach will convert the protein into simpler protein. Finally, those food will enter the small intestine, whereby the bile, which is released by the liver, will emulsify the fats. So this will allow fats to have greater surface area for the enzyme lipase to add on. So the chemical digestion in the small intestine is actually everything. Fats get converted into fatty acid and glycerol by lipase, starch to maltose by the intestinal amylase, and finally maltose into the simplest unit of carbohydrate, which is glucose. And the enzyme responsible for this reaction is maltase. Finally, protein is digested by protease into simpler protein, and because small intestine is long, there's enough time for more protease to convert the simpler protein into amino acid. So please copy down this table. I think it's a very useful summary. And that will be all.